In this episode of The Leader Smith, I'm going to talk about the Cobra effect. It's episode 39. Thanks for listening.
In a world of incompetent bosses, micromanagers, and petty tyrants, you are listening to The Leader Smith. Now, here is your host, Darren Gertis.
Okay, so what is the Cobra effect? The Cobra effect is an article written by the Foundation for Economic Education. It's on the lessons of unintended consequences. Sometimes human beings react differently than legislators would have expected to the rules that they create. This is true in leadership in the public sphere or in the private sphere, and I'll give you a number of examples of how that works. So, for example, the senior executives at Airbus thought it would be a great idea to make planes quieter, and they worked really hard. They tasked their engineers to make the flying experience as quiet as possible. They made the A380 so quiet, according to this article, that passengers could hear with far too much clarity what was happening in the plane's bathrooms. So sometimes there's a backfiring effect, if I can use that term. The first wage and price controls in World War II actually are what gave us a system that we have right now where our health insurance comes from our work, not something that we buy on our own. And that's because there were laws that prohibited these employers from raising wages, and that happened as a consequence of these price controls in World War II. And then we doubled down on it in 1951 when Congress decided that they would not tax health insurance benefits. They wouldn't count them as taxable income, and so it just exacerbated the system where if you get health insurance now, it's almost always through your job, and it's very expensive to get it somewhere else. That's an unintended consequence of earlier actions. It's not something that any of the legislators were thinking was going to happen when they created the original price controls. They were just trying to tamper with the system so that they could get a certain effect at that time. But there's almost always an unintended consequence, and you don't control the response. You only control your effect. So here's an example: Cobras and this is why it's called the Cobra effect. In Delhi, India, Cobras were a real problem. They were running through the street. Well, not running. They were slithering around through the streets. The government decided, hey, we're going to get rid of these Cobras that are everywhere, and so they decided to give a bounty. So anybody who had killed a Cobra and brought it down to the municipal government would be able to see a reward for that Cobra. So they did that, and it had a successful effect. People went and did some other things. So they would go out and grow these Cobras. They'd catch them and start to breed them in their homes. Well, the government noticed that the Cobra population was diminished significantly, but they were still, people were still collecting these rewards for bringing in dead Cobras. And so they realized, oh, something else is going on. The authorities decided, hey, there's really not any Cobras around, let's stop the bounty program. And when they stopped the bounty program, which was a very rational thing to do, the homeowners that were breeding Cobras in their homes also did the rational thing, and they released the Cobras back into the streets. And guess what? There was a huge Cobra problem again. It was worse than what it was before. That is an unintended consequence. And so that's why unintended consequences are sometimes called the Cobra effect. Other examples include things, and this author goes on and talks about air pollution in Mexico City. Huge problem with air pollution, so the government decided to regulate and said a very reasonable program. They said, look, 20% of the cars on any given day would be off the street based on their license plate number. So if you had 100,000 cars, 20,000, I'm just using round numbers, 20,000 are off on any given day based on the letters on the license plate. So, and it would rotate on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, in that kind of way. So, yeah, so it seems like now you're down to 80% of the cars, you're going to have less smog. But there's a great line in here. People's needs, this is a quote, people's needs do not change as the result of a simple government decree. Whether that's a government decree or a order from above in your organization, that's true. It's like this $1 billion cut in the police budget in New York City. People's needs did not change just because they slashed $1 billion out of the budget. They still need a certain level of policing, and there's going to be an unintended consequence that we're going to be watching with great interest. Okay, so at any rate, back to the air pollution example in Mexico City. So some people carpooled, and that's the idea. It was trying to force people into carpooling or public transportation. Others took taxis, but those taxis generally were giving off more pollution because they were older vehicles, and that's what they were used for. Still, other people bought a second car in order to get around the license plate thing, so they could drive the other car when the license plate, when the regular car's license plate number was up, they could drive their other car. And those cars, they would always buy the worst, the cheapest cars they could find. And when they did, those were giving off even more pollution. So there's unintended consequences. I was thinking about this, and I went to another article that gave other examples of unintended consequences. Macquarie Island is this tiny little island somewhere between New Zealand and Antarctica, and people didn't even know it was there for many years. It was so isolated from everything. I'm going to quote right from the article. So there are so many seals soon attracted hunters. The hunters' ships brought unwanted stowaways in the forms of rats. So it seemed like a good idea to introduce cats. What you're seeing is there's already one problem happening. The humans show up. They accidentally bring in the rats. And then they think, oh, we're going to have cats to kill the rats. They also added rabbits because, rabbits were a good food source, and they reproduce very quickly, and so you would be able to eat rabbits if you ran out of other stuff. Okay, at any rate, all three invaders, the rats, the cats, and the rabbits, all three invaders, quote, were soon wreaking havoc on the island's delicate ecosystem, but it seemed to be the cats that were causing the most destruction. The feral felines ate their way through the island's birds with such remorseless efficiency that conservationists set out to eradicate them. By the year 2000, Macquarie Island was judged to be entirely cat-free, but its problems were not over. With their only predator gone, the island's rabbits were free to do what they do best. They breed and eat. Within a matter of years, they consumed 40% of the island's vegetation. The impact has been described as an ecological meltdown. And the subsequent campaign to repair the damage and eradicate the island's rabbits, which is only now nearing completion, has already cost millions of dollars. I mean, it reminds me of that Monty Python Holy Grail. That rabbit is dynamite. Yeah, that's right. Even rabbits can be destructive if you don't think about the unintended consequences. Well, what if these rabbits reproduce and eat all the vegetation on the island? So we understand that the cat could be a problem. Sure, I get that. Or we understand that the rat could be a problem. But we have to think about every potential problem and the unintended consequences. Another example in this particular article is they talk about, so the Titanic was a disaster. We all know that. And they're talking about the Eastland disaster. You probably never heard of the Eastland disaster. Let me talk about the Titanic first. The article doesn't talk about it, but I'll give you some background. So the Titanic was supposed to be this unsinkable ship. In fact, they said that even God himself couldn't sink the ship. And that was because they designed it in such a way that they compartmentalized the boat so that if there was a hole in this compartment, it would fill with water, but the rest of the boat would be fine. And then if there was a hole in that compartment, it would fill with water, but the rest of the boat would be fine. The problem is they ripped a hole horizontally in the ship. So this compartment, that compartment, that compartment, the other compartment, and the other compartment were filling with water, and it went down. So they were a little kind of overly optimistic about it, and they didn't have enough lifeboats on the Titanic to save people. And as a result, there was a terrible disaster where somewhere near 1,500 people lost their lives. Okay. So that was in 1912. Roll the clock forward in 1915. Just because of the Titanic disaster, we passed a law that every new American ship had to, over a certain weight of tonnage, over I think it was 100 tons, had to carry lifeboats enough for every passenger. Well, lifeboats are heavy, and so now you have all this extra weight being added to the lifeboats. And remember, it's only on these that are already heavy, over 100 tons. And so the SS Eastland, and now I'm going to quote here, the SS Eastland was a badly designed, ungainly vessel at the best of times. The extra weight of several additional lifeboats crammed into her top deck turned her into an unstable death trap. On July 24th, 1915, just yards from her moorings in the Chicago River, she tilted alarmingly, took on water, rolled over in just 20 feet of water. While some lucky survivors were able to literally step from the Eastland's upturned hull onto dry land, many less fortunate individuals were trapped below decks thrown into the water. More than 800 people lost their lives in the disaster. That's the unintended consequence. And so we have to think about unintended consequences. They're everywhere. Think about the Treaty of Versailles. The article talks about the Treaty of Versailles as well. So in October of 1918, Germany has an armistice. They formally surrender in November of 1918. Hitler will go back and call them the October criminals. That's the people that made the armistice agreement. And Germany surrender. They have this formal process that leads to the French city of Versailles, and we have the Treaty of Versailles. And Germany is forced to accept sole responsibility for causing the war, even though they didn't actually cause the war. Their army was reduced. They have to pay these war reparations, and the Treaty of Versailles is hated by Germans. I mean, they hate it. Now, the Treaty of Versailles, without the Treaty of Versailles and the subsequent depression that followed, I don't think you could have had the rise of Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler, kept pointing back to the Treaty of Versailles, and the German people, the average German citizen felt that the Treaty of Versailles was unfair, and when Hitler was talking about it, they agreed. So a key factor that led to World War II was the Treaty of Versailles that concluded World War I. So you have to be careful with the unintended consequences. Okay, there's another example here that I want to go through, and then I'll wrap up with some business examples. So another fascinating example is during the Cultural Revolution, or not the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward in 1958. Mao Zedong is trying to transform China, and so he sets his sights on 4 pests: flies, mosquitoes, rats, and birds. A very specific type of bird was sparrows, and they had, he thought that this was a problem. They were, eating things that were causing the farmers to be less than productive, and so we're going to wipe out these 4 pests. And China's population, I'm not making this up, China's population is trying to kill all the sparrows that they can, and they are pretty good at what they did, and they wiped out most of the sparrows, and there was a terrible result. Nobody saw this coming. I'm going to quote it here. While sparrows did eat small amounts of seeds, the bulk of their diet was made up of insects. With the sparrows gone, China was overrun by a plague of locusts. Entire crops were lost. Mao belatedly realized his mistake and reintroduced sparrows obtained from the Soviet Union. But by then, much of the damage was done, and more than 20 million people starved to death in one of history's most terrible famines. Okay, so back to the original article. There are a number of examples of unintended consequences. We think about seatbelt laws, like they're making you safer. Well, they're making the driver safer and perhaps people in the vehicle, but they're making it more dangerous, perhaps, for pedestrians and cyclists because drivers are a little less cautious. In fact, there's at least one economist that I'm aware of that said that if you want to make drivers even more careful, take out the airbags and put in spikes, and that way they'll have a little skin in the game. Now, he's saying that tongue-in-cheek, but you get the idea. Now you're thinking of it differently. Okay, payday lending loans. We think about payday lending loans and these laws that will keep people from paying high interest rates as good things. And I guess the intent is good, but this is the point. The consequence of protecting people from these low income people from high lending rates is that if they can't get it, they have to go to higher rates. If they can't qualify, so they have to go to even more expensive alternatives. The same kind of thing played out in the Civil War, right? So there was a bunch of people that were upset that, so you could pay somebody to take your place during the Civil War, and people were upset. Wait, if you pay somebody $150, they can take, or you pay $150, I think it was, which sounds like nothing, but that was a lot of money back then because we've so devalued the dollar. But now I'm digressing. If you pay them this fee, they take your place, and they go to war instead of you. And how terrible is that? So they got rid of that system, jacked the price up to something like 300 or 350. So it was so expensive that now only the super rich could actually afford to do it, and they did. And so when they're trying to fix an inequality, they fixed it by making it more unequal. And we do that all the time, and we're not aware of how we do that. So you have to be aware of unintended consequences. Okay, another example similar to that actually is the requirement that corporations, here I'm quoting, the requirements that corporations publicize how much they pay their CEOs in order to encourage stockholders to reduce CEO pay resulted in lesser paid CEOs demanding more pay. How about that? So now it made it more a larger gap between the average employee and CEOs when CEOs found out how much less they were making than other CEOs and demanded more pay from their boards. The three strikes law, I'm quoting again, the three strikes law is intended to reduce crime, increase police fatalities by giving two-time criminals a greater incentive to evade or even fight the police, because I don't want to go to jail for life. Okay, next, the Americans with Disabilities Act gives employers an incentive to discriminate against the disabled by not hiring them in the first place so as to avoid potential ADA claims. And there's some data that shows that that may have been an unintended consequence of the act. People will subvert the actual law itself. That's illegal, but that's what they do. Electrician licensing requirements can increase the incidence of an injury due to faulty electrical work. Why? It seems like, well, if you're requiring licensed work, why wouldn't that? Well, because it's reducing the supply of electricians, thereby encouraging homeowners to do their own electrical work. And that's a full quote. Well, okay, so we do stupid things like this all the time. You have to really be cautious, and you have to think about what it is that you're going to do when you choose to do this or to do that. Let me end with this. The article ends with Venezuela. A lot of people don't know much about Venezuela. They hear conservatives talk about, well, Venezuela is a socialist train wreck. Here's what happened in Venezuela. So in Venezuela, in 1976, they nationalized their oil industry. That is, the government seized control of private oil industry, and they took over. And that was great because now they just essentially were pirates and stole from the private industry and had this thing. And it's producing all this oil. And for a while, life was good because now they had all this big income producing thing. But when government takes over something, it doesn't tend to treat it as well as when private interest is taking over something. And so they didn't take care of their capital equipment. It deteriorates. After a while, Venezuela's oil production stopped working as well. The physical capital begins to break, and they don't take care of it like it should. Oil production begins to fall. As oil production falls, the government has been giving out money hand over fist to people. Goodies all over the place to the population. That's what socialist governments tend to do. And so when they can't do it because they now have that resource of the private oil, they're doing it in a different way. They start borrowing and taxing in order to do it. They start printing more money. And when they're printing more money, every dollar that they print makes every other dollar. I don't remember what the Venezuelan equivalent of a dollar is, but every other dollar would be worth less. So there's an unintended consequence of their first thing is that it breaks down. An unintended consequence of borrowing and taxing causes inflation. And the unintended consequence of printing causes inflation, and people can't afford food. So the government imposes price controls. Remember World War II we talked about? So they impose price controls, and there's a new unintended consequence where now farmers can't afford to grow the food because the government imposed price controls to keep food at a lower level, and so it's not worth it. So farmers stop growing food. So it creates a famine kind of situation. Now they're pushing farmers, forcing people to go work on farms because it's that desperate. I talked about this to a small degree in a different episode when I was talking to Brian Miller about what was going on in Colombia. You have hundreds of thousands of refugees from Venezuela flooding over the Colombian border to escape this because of unintended consequence following unintended consequence following unintended consequence following unintended consequence. Okay, so unintended consequences also, it sounds like it's all bad, but it's not necessarily all bad. It's just think about the side effect. And that's going to bring us to the quotation for contemplation for today, and that is this. It's from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He's a brilliant scholar who has written a great deal about flow states, about happiness, how you get there. He said this, quote, "Half a century ago, the Austrian psychologist Viktor Frankl wrote that happiness cannot be attained by wanting to be happy. It must come as the unintended consequence of working for a goal greater than oneself." So there's this, it's like a side effect, but you don't get to choose the side effect. So you have to be careful when you're choosing what it is that you're doing now, because there's going to be a reaction, and you want to make sure that those reactions are in line with what your ambition is. Okay, so thanks for your time. Thanks for listening to this episode about the Cobra effect. If you like this episode or you like this podcast, consider subscribing, because I'm putting out daily content and I want you to be the kind of leader that you would want to follow.